Welcome to Writers Read. Here we are again to hear two readers, Ann Irish and Barbara Ray. But you know the routine. Before we start hearing the writers read, we get to say Paul Niebank's wonderful poem. I say a line, and then you say a line. Write, write, write.
Write, write, write.
Until you get it right.
Until you get it right.
Then read aloud.
Then read aloud.
You'll draw a crowd.
You'll draw a crowd.
And bring us great delight.
And bring us great delight.
I'm going to start again with the 3-ring binder from the library. And it's a notebook of hard copies of people who have read short pieces, not part of a book, not part of a magazine or a journal, but short pieces. And the people who already have put their pieces in here read in the spring and fall of 2021. And so we're starting a new session for 2022. These are the people in this book: Ina Bray, George Counts, Peggy Johnson, Paul Niebank, Lou Templeton, Audrey Whitecamp, Nancy Wiesner, Cassandra Carruthers, Mary Piet, Gussie Howe, and Grace Popoff. So, I love this collection. It's on the windowsill in the library if you want to read this. Okay, Ann Irish, welcome. And Ann is a pretty new resident. Is that right, Ann?
Yes, I moved here in June.
So she's getting her feet wet. But before we met, I asked Ann two things. I said, Ann, could I mention your email address? She said yes. And then I said, would you also share a writer you enjoy reading? So the answer to the first question was yes. Her email address is Vashon Ann. She lived on Vashon Island for so many years. How many years, Ann?
I think 66 years.
That's her right address then, isn't it? Vashon Ann. And Ann, did you give some thought to some writers that you enjoy reading?
Yes, and if it's okay, I'd like to mention one who writes fiction and one who writes nonfiction.
Wonderful.
Starting with the fiction writer, Nevil Shute. You do remember him because he wrote before World War II and afterward, an Englishman who ended up in Australia. And yes, he writes fiction, and he doesn't have the most elegant writing style, but I love the way he talks about people. He certainly enjoys and appreciates his characters. He respects them, even when they do things that he doesn't like. And somehow I think after I read one of his books, or reread one of his books, this is the way we should feel about people we talk to. Now for nonfiction, Doris Kearns Goodwin. As you know, she writes presidential biographies. And the first one that I read, the one about the Roosevelts, that is Eleanor and Franklin, I read about the time I was writing a biography of a man who was Speaker of the House while FDR was president. So it was one that was very useful to me. And by now I've read all her books, including one that really surprised me when I heard its title, Wait Till Next Year. I thought, no, I know, that's baseball. But yes, that was the title.
That was the title.
Yes. And it's a wonderful book. And I started reading it, and I thought, you know what? She's writing my story. That's me. And my sister is sitting back there can tell you, you bet that's what I was like as a kid. I truly was interested in baseball. And some things were different, of course, from what Doris Kearns Goodwin writes about, because we lived in different cities, supported different teams. She was Catholic, I was Protestant, but we had a family life that was difficult at times. We both had a parent die during our childhood. And you know, from reading that book, the first thing I got was an appreciation, a feeling that, okay, this loving of baseball is perfectly okay. There's nothing wrong with it. I'm not dumb, you know? And then I appreciated somebody like Doris Kearns Goodwin saying it's okay to have a love like that. And also just the lessons she taught me about growing up in that book are something that sticks with me to this day. So those are my two choices.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that, Anne. And we look forward to hearing you read your writing today.
You know what we didn't do? We didn't put a map up. Do you want to show people a map briefly?
How would that work, Carrie?
I don't know if she can edit.
Okay, but we won't do it then.
Yeah.
We'll hope everybody can figure it out, and I can get a map out later
Oh.
at the end of the reading
Okay, maybe
and
so.
show it to you. Okay, this is a chapter from a book that hasn't been published yet, and the name of the book is It's Always Uphill from the Dock, the story of the Puget Sound Islands. This is chapter 4, The Pig War. The border conflict called the Pig War dominated events in the San Juan Islands and nearby areas for several decades in the 19th century. Because of this conflict, the story of European American settlement in the San Juan Islands is unique. At first, British settlers came, sent to confirm their nation's sovereignty over the area. This was the era when many Americans felt that territorial expansion, including the San Juan Islands, was the manifest destiny of the United States. Overlapping claims to these islands meant years of contention and has been known as the Pig War. In 1846, the British and Americans adopted a border treaty for the Northwest. It stated, "The line of boundary between the territories of the United States and those of Her Britannic Majesty shall be continued westward along the said 49th parallel of north latitude to the middle of the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver's Island, and thence southerly through the middle of said channel and of De Fuca's Straits to the Pacific Ocean." The treaty paid no attention to the existence of the San Juan Islands, which are in the middle of the specified channel. Both British and American officials notified their governments of the agreement's ambiguity, but despite this, the governments accepted the treaty. Because of concern about the international boundary, the British soon worked to secure a claim on the San Juan Islands, establishing a Hudson's Bay Company outpost on San Juan Island. As the HBC was a fur trading enterprise, the company did not want people to settle in company territories, because when settlers came, animals disappeared. James Douglas, in charge of the HBC's Fort Victoria, later the city of Victoria, British Columbia, carefully discouraged settlement on the San Juans, but hoped to solidify the British claim to them. In 1850, he dispatched a man to San Juan Island to establish a fishing camp. Several men returned the next year and built a small structure at the camp for salting fish that Indians brought to them. And I use the term Indians because it expresses best the fact that some of these were from Canada and others from the United States. Indians covers them all. Douglas, now governor of Vancouver Island while he remained regional head of the HBC, took additional action in December 1853. He sent Charles J. Griffin with 1,369 sheep and a few Hawaiian men known as Kanakas to establish a sheep farm near Eagle Cove on San Juan Island. Griffin and crew created a ranch he called Bellevue Sheep Farm, built 6 log cabins, cleared land for pasture, and planted some to oats. The men cut a wide passage called a sheep run to the open land in the center of the island, brought in a few other farm animals, and created 3 additional sheep farms on the island. 6 years later, the flocks had grown to 4,500 sheep. Of course, an official American response followed. In 1854, the Washington Territorial Legislature designated the San Juan Islands as part of Whatcom County. San Juan County was not created until 1873, after the matter of sovereignty was finally settled. Colonel Isaac N. Eby of Whidbey Island, the recently appointed customs collector for Puget Sound, gave British rancher Griffin a bill for customs duty because imports to the U.S. were subject to this tax, and the HBC farm had indeed imported animals to San Juan Island. Griffin ignored the bill, and Governor Douglas appointed a British customs collector. Meanwhile, Whatcom County Sheriff Ellis Barnes went to the Hudson's Bay farm to collect the tax. No HBC man would honor this request. On March 30th, 1855, Barnes returned with about 6 armed men to force payment without result. Barnes and his men therefore went looking for sheep and eventually found a herd that included expensive rams brought for breeding. The sheriff immediately auctioned the sheep off to his associates for a pittance, and then the men struggled to get the animals onto their boat, finally managing to leave the island with 34 sheep. The subsequent British claim for the sheep was never paid. Adding to the concerns of people in the San Juans, Indians continued to appear from the north now and then, sometimes frightening settlers. The Indians did not threaten HBC camps, however, because the company had worked with native people for many years, employing and trading with them in the search for furs and food. James Douglas ordered 2 British ships to patrol the waters. Meanwhile, 2 U.S. Army companies arrived in the area out of worry about possible Indian attacks. Captain George E. Pickett, later a famous Confederate general, led one of them. All of this was the opening act of the long and mostly peaceful conflict between the 2 nations known as the Pig War. As the 1850s approached an end, about 20 people worked on San Juan Island for the HBC, 3 of these being U.S. citizens. About 10 other settlers could be found on the island. Such was the situation when the pig incident occurred. Lyman Cutler of Kentucky came to San Juan Island in 1859 and began farming on an island site near Bellevue Sheep Farm. He planted a patch of potatoes without adequately fencing the plot, and soon a Hudson's Bay pig discovered it. On June 15, 1859, the pig rooted among the potatoes, and Cutler shot the offender, a Berkshire boar. He told the HBC's Griffin that he had killed the pig and that he would pay for the animal. He later claimed that he had shot the pig only after its repeated visits to the potatoes, while Griffin charged that Cutler offered shockingly inadequate compensation. Griffin was already frustrated, as some of the other Americans on the island had settled on land he had been using in his sheep operation. At this time, Brigadier General William S. Harney, who commanded American Army operations in the Northwest, was on an inspection tour of military forts in the area. On July 9th, his ship, the USS Massachusetts, appeared just off San Juan Island. Historian Michael Voury has written that Harney had an active imagination, occasionally bordering on paranoia, and that he hated taking orders from superior officers because he believed he had no superiors. Once among the San Juans, Harney heard about the pig dispute, perhaps embellished in the telling. Soon, 22 American settlers signed a petition asking him to provide protection against northern Indians. In response, Captain Pickett and 68 men landed on July 27th and set up camp near the HBC farm. Pickett then proclaimed American authority over the island. Governor Douglas in Victoria, who was also rather hot-headed, sent Royal Marines under Captain Jeffrey Hornby on the HMS Tribune to the island. Hornby, not wishing to provoke hostilities, kept the men on shipboard. Soon, 3 British ships lay offshore, and their captains conferred with Pickett, suggesting a joint military occupation of the island. The American commander did not agree, but proposed that he contact his superior, Harney. During these troubled days, Lieutenant Colonel Silas Casey arrived with more U.S. troops. He arranged that the American camp be moved to a better protected site while remaining near Bellevue Farm. Additional soldiers disembarked, and soon over 400 men were at work fortifying the camp area. As construction on the American camp proceeded, British response awaited orders from London. In Washington, D.C., when President James Buchanan learned of the military activity on San Juan Island, he ordered caution and sent out another military man, General Winfield S. Scott, to investigate. Scott had been active in the War of 1812 and had led an invasion force in the Mexican War. By 1859, he was the most prominent military officer in the United States. General Scott arrived at the Strait of Juan de Fuca in October 1859 and met with Douglas, each one polite but ready to support his nation's position. Scott ordered that many of the troops and the heavy guns be withdrawn. Soon, work stopped on the American fortress. Scott suggested that the U.S. and Great Britain each keep a small military contingent on the island in separate camps. Soon, the 2 governments agreed that each could station up to 100 men on the island to keep the peace while diplomats settled the sovereignty issue. The peace held, and men from each camp became friendly with one another. Orders arrived in January 1860 for establishment of a British camp on San Juan Island. The officers considered several possible locations for it, including the site of the future town of Friday Harbor, but instead chose a site on the island's northwest coast, about 11 miles north of the American camp. The British site was pleasant, spacious, and well-watered. Building the camp began in the spring. Although the camp was a British installation, its name, English Camp, has endured. Captain George Bazalgette, commander of the British, arrived with 86 men on March 21st, 1860. From 1860 to 1872, American and British troops occupied San Juan Island. On and off, Captain Pickett commanded the American troops stationed there, but he resigned his commission in 1861 to fight in the Confederate Army. After the Civil War began in April that year, some U.S. Army officials considered abandoning American camp, but because of the significance of the border question in this possibly strategic region, the camp stayed open. With the camps established, civilians drifted to the island to meet the troops' needs and desires. In 1860, only 73 civilians have lived on the island, but by 1870 there were 457. The soldiers, both British and American, found their days on San Juan Island dull. Life was hard at first as the men had to work to establish the camps. Soon the officers had pleasant living quarters. Both camps housed everyone else in barracks, and both camps included small hospitals. English camp facilities, which even included a reading room for the men, were superior to the poorly heated and inadequately maintained American barracks. The U.S. government did not appropriate funds for upkeep. English camp featured a blockhouse on the shore, which has been restored, as though standing guard for today's visitors. With the 2 camps in place, military life settled down to routine activities. For most of the next 12 years, the 2 small military detachments on opposite sides of the island had little to do except keep peace among the settlers. Most of the activities on the island by both nations' soldiers involved controlling illicit liquor and prostitution. Many of the men on the island, soldiers and civilians alike, became quite friendly with the Indian women, who were the only women available at the time. A few of these liaisons led to marriages, which produced some of San Juan Island's pioneer families.
Yes. Oh, wonderful. And
There's more,
is a
there's more.
treat.
You're only halfway through.
Oh, okay.
We haven't finished the pig war yet.
No, we
No,
haven't.
no.
Okay.
My voice only lasts so long. Anyway, for the men in both armies, occasional celebrations, often including men from both camps, broke the tedium. Foot soldiers from both nations no doubt marched from one camp to the other, but the British officers had horses, while the Americans depended mainly on mules. Queen Victoria's May 24th birthday and America's July 4th Independence Day offered reasons for holiday festivities in which settlers as well as soldiers took part. The U.S. soldiers held 4th of July celebrations even through the Civil War years. Many social events featured horse races. In one particular year, British horse Bessie beat American Siwash, while Captain Pickett was thrown by his mount.
Oh.
Dances and special dinners also dotted the camp calendars. Such fraternization helped pass the time. But the abundance of alcohol helped fuel violence, even murder, on the island. The unsettled jurisdiction of the island encouraged immorality, for no one was sure what the law was. Military authorities and civilian officials did not always agree on the legal authority regarding the civilians. Ungovernable, lawless characters appeared to drift to San Juan Island because of its indeterminate status. The lack of taxation also drew various sorts of people to the island. Pickett charged that the village on the island was a depot for murderers, robbers, whiskey sellers, in a word, all refugees from justice. In 1862, Lyman A. Bissell, newly in command of American camp, banished tough customers from the island, though he had questionable authority for this action. He created a small military police force and ordered the men to search all arriving boats to prevent liquor from being smuggled onto the island. He also arranged arbitration in cases of civilian quarrels. E.T. Hamlet, the island's Justice of the Peace, who held office in one of the saloons, led a protest by some of the settlers. Major Bissell had forbidden the government mail carrier from carrying any mail for the citizens, he wrote. Bissell also made decisions regarding land ownership, perpetually causing controversy. Ironically, Americans who had called for troops to come and support their nation's claim to the island now disliked military authority. Island residents and American officials alike chafed at some of the actions. In October 1865, Thomas Gray replaced Captain Bissell. Gray's arbitrary decisions led to more confrontations. He even turned away the men from English camp who came to join the Americans' 4th of July celebration. Some thought Gray's regime almost amounted to martial law. Civil authorities protested, and the Washington Territorial Legislature responded by petitioning Congress for relief from Gray's arbitrary rule. Secretary of State William Seward ruled that civil authorities were subservient to the military officials on the island. Gray was soon relieved of duty, yet civilians on the island remained subject to military decisions. The military occupation of San Juan Island finally ended in 1872. In January 1871, the two governments agreed to submit the question of San Juan Island's sovereignty to arbitration. German Emperor Wilhelm I agreed to be arbiter, and he was to decide whether the international boundary was meant to be Rosario Strait, east of the San Juan Islands, or Haro Strait, west of the group. The emperor appointed a 3-man committee of experts to consider the question. 2 were eminent judges, and the third a leading geographer. The US and Great Britain each submitted detailed arguments. One of the judges felt that although some factors favored the British claim, by comparison the Americans had the stronger case based on records and correspondence cited in the testimony. These showed that British motivation in the border treaty had been merely to confirm that Vancouver Island was British, and moreover, that Haro Strait, not Rosario Strait, was the main navigable waterway. The geography announced his concurrence with these views. The other judge, however, vehemently held that the proper decision would be to run the boundary down the middle of the archipelago. Thus, San Juan and nearby small islands would be British, while Orcas, Shaw, Lopez, and the islands to the east would be American. Directions submitted to the emperor for arbitration, though, had asked that the emperor choose between only 2 alternatives, Rosario or Haro Strait. One might wonder why a division of the archipelago was not included as a possibility. Secretary of State Hamilton Fish had made clear that the US would not accept this, probably because San Juan Island could be strategically significant. The British, in turn, had worried about the possibility of Americans fortifying San Juan Island, threatening the approaches to Victoria and the Canadian mainland. On the other hand, both nations were anxious to settle the question. Britain had concern about the balance of power in Europe and wanted the US as an ally should the need arise. Finally, in comparison to both Rosario and Haro Straits, the middle channel is very narrow. Imagine the ease of smuggling everything from people to illicit drugs across the passage between the south ends of Lopez and San Juan Islands, about a 3/4 of a mile canoe paddle. Haro Strait, which became the border waterway, varies in width, but on average is about 7 miles wide. Since a decision for the middle channel could not be considered, the emperor awarded the islands to the US. The date was October 21st, 1872. Joint occupation of San Juan Island therefore ended, and the 2 forces disbanded their military camps. The end of the conflict set the stage for the creation of San Juan County, and Friday Harbor became the county seat. Its only building at the time was a simple, hastily erected structure designated to be the courthouse. The US Army sold most of the American camp buildings at auction, and at English Camp, the commandant's house eventually became the property of pioneer William Crook. Quickly, most of the British who settled began procedures to obtain American citizenship, perhaps figuring wrongly that they could otherwise lose their property. More than half the British who stayed on the island became US citizens. Unfortunately for them, as well as other settlers, taxes could now be collected. As for the Hudson's Bay Company and Lyman Cutler, both left San Juan Island. HBC agent Robert Firth leased Bellevue Sheep Farm from the British firm. He homesteaded on the property and became an American citizen. American farmer Robert Fraser took over Lyman Cutler's land. Cutler, meanwhile, remained on the island for a few years, and in 1860 became a partner in a firm formed to extract lime. Apparently, he later left for the American mainland and died there in 1874. Meanwhile, San Juan Island, along with the rest of the archipelago, could be officially opened for settlement. The San Juan Islands today attract many Canadian visitors as well as Americans. Among the places that tourists see are English and American camps. Interest in the pig ore and the increasing number of visitors to the sites of the 2 camps led to the creation of San Juan Island National Historical Park, encompassing both camps. For many years, the Crook family lived on land they owned at the English campsite. They resisted selling land for a park, but finally allowed Washington State to purchase it in 1963. 3 years later, Congress approved creation of the national park. Interested visitors had already been inspecting the sites where English and American camps had once existed, and now preservation work and restoration began. The work uncovered a treasure, money William Crook had hidden. In over 60 years, his son Jim never found it, but it turned up in a pot hidden behind the hatch cover leading to the attic of the English camp barracks. It was given to Jim's sister, 91-year-old Rhoda Anderson. The two portions of the park differ markedly. American camp sits on a wide, open, windswept plain featuring distant views and a nearby lighthouse. English camp, on the other hand, is in a pleasant green cove surrounded by trees. In addition to its blockhouse, it includes a reconstruction of the small formal garden created during the British occupation. Perhaps 1/3 of a mile inland and uphill is a small cemetery enclosed by a white picket fence. Here lie 1 civilian and 5 of Britain's 7 Marines who died during the occupation. None in battle, for relations had remained good throughout the years of occupation. With settlement of the Pig War, for the first time in the history of the United States, there was no boundary dispute with Great Britain, noted President Lyndon Baines Johnson on September 9th, 1966, when he signed the bill to create the park. In 1976, 100 years after Kaiser Wilhelm's decision, Friday Harbor businesses closed so that all islanders might attend a commemoration at English camp. When British and American people first came to the San Juans, no one imagined that a disagreement about the island's sovereignty would lead to years of uncertainty. After an American killed a British pig, commanders for both nations brought troops to the island. Higher officials decided that only small numbers of them would stay to prevent war while maintaining a claim to the islands. Thus, the Pig War was a war that did not happen. As a reminder of what might have been, however, as well as of the friendship that continues between the two nations, the only place in the entire United States National Park system where a British flag now flies is on San Juan Island.
Oh, Anne, thank you so much.
Sorry, my voice wasn't
Oh, and it was a special gift to me because I lived on San Juan Island for 25 years, so
Where did you live?
close to town.
All right.
Yeah. But thank you, Anne.
Oh, sure.
Is the book going to be published or how?
It's at the publisher. You have to ask him.
Oh,
So
and the title of the book?
it's always uphill from the dock.
Excellent. Oh, thank you, Anne, so much.
Okay, well, you're more than welcome. And I can get the maps out now, or I can do that later?
Later, maybe.
All right, that
Okay.
sounds fine. Let's see.
Welcome, Barbara. So good to see you. And I want you to know that I keep my copy of your book, Don't Push the River, close by, because I'm one of the people that needs to not push the river. Thank you for titling your book that way, and I'm looking forward to hearing you read. Mention a writer, though, that you enjoy reading.
I don't read books as much as I used to because I spend an awful lot of time reading The Guardian Weekly, which gives me short stories which are good for my attention span and gives me a lot more about the world. But I really and truly enjoy Thich Nhat Hanh for his philosophies.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Okay, what shall we hear today?
Well, my life has been spent a lot around the water, sailing, and I'm going to give you a little bit about a time when my husband, well, I'll start, new beginnings, finding the little St. Anthony. By the end of the summer of 1973, Bob's work, my husband, building the Bay Area Rapid Transit Tube under San Francisco Bay was complete, and the next job was not yet on the horizon. For the interim, he was persuaded by his brother to help him develop an invention which Jim had invested in. And we spent the next few months in Phoenix. Before the end of the project, we felt wiser about working with family. Nonetheless, it was a good time. We left Arizona one morning in early March before the already scorching sun was too high. It took a couple of days to enjoy the drive home up the Southern California coast to our apartment in the marina in San Francisco. Back in San Francisco, it was one of those times when engineering job opportunities for Bob were few and far between. He was a specialist dredging engineer, and it depended entirely where in the world there needed to be a harbor or a tunnel or anything that he called invisible sculpture under the water. We began to explore ideas of making a living doing something we could do together, and gave a thumbs down on a possible printing franchise or bed and breakfast, which I felt everything was going to be potentially high service maintenance from too many points of view. And we both agreed about that. And so after these lackluster diversions and following clues, we were more than ready for a little quiet time to get some perspective and to do some serious thinking about the future with no interruptions. The obvious thing to do was to take advantage of the lovely spring weather and sail Erin Moore, our 32-foot Camper Nicholson sailboat, up to the Sacramento Delta for a week or so. We had no deadlines. One day, while we were at anchor, refining the perfect Delta pastime, which is doing nothing, we watched a yacht, not much bigger than ours, sail by, fitted out with outrigger poles and trailing fish lines. Bob muttered something that he might seriously consider commercial salmon fishing, and we mulled over the general idea as we sailed home. The thought struck a chord for us both. Once back in San Francisco, our enthusiasm for the potential developed. We examined our possibilities. We could sell Erin Moore. We had some savings. The rent on our apartment in the marina was affordable. We had only a few more child support payments for Bob's sons. We were in our mid-40s and healthy, and our own needs were very simple. With Bob's lifetime experience on the ocean and my love for the water, we both felt confident that we were up to this challenge together. We felt hopeful with the idea of creating something new for ourselves. One of the strengths of our marriage partnership was that we were both optimists and had some experience with risk-taking and what it takes for survival. At first we had a romantic notion of finding a classic Monterey fishing boat, but that really wasn't realistic. The 28-foot Montereys were built around the turn of the 20th century, mainly for sailing to the Farallon Islands for shrimp and to gather gulls' eggs. They were sturdy but far too small. Our needs called for something more substantial with roomy holds for a salmon catch. So began the weeks of driving up and down the California coast, scouring the ports from Eureka to Monterey for fishing boats. There were hundreds to look at, from overpriced antique classics to barely seaworthy worn-out rust buckets, and very few good vessels we could afford, even if they were for sale. Our search began in earnest in the spring of 1974. Waking before dawn each day, we packed sandwiches and a thermos of coffee before setting out to drive the coastal highway. We had one goal in mind: to find the perfect fishing boat. And I will remember forever some of the breathtaking sunrises and silhouettes of the coastal scenery through the morning mists. There's an indescribable quality of light in California, and it seems to inspire us through this great adventure. It didn't matter that we seemed reckless to have such slim resources. We simply sensed we were on the right track and would find a way. We bounced, slithered and struggled up and down dozens of piers, gangplanks and docks for the next few weeks, often dismayed by the unworthiness of the rotting hulls to which their owner fishermen entrusted their lives. Then one day, tied up to a rickety old pier in Point Arena Harbour, there was the little St. Anthony. True, she was neglected, shabby, and in need of at least a coat of paint. What we saw was a handsome 38 classic wooden hull full of potential for our needs. Since it was mid-fishing season, most of the working boats were out, and there were few people around to answer our questions. No one seemed to know where her owner was, only that his name was Kelly, and his home port was Monterey. We gathered that he was a quiet, private man, and there were hints about his personal life, but it was obvious we would be told nothing more. Other than the boat might be for sale, we felt we had a lead, however elusive. Back in San Francisco, where Vince, our friendly harbor master in the marina, realized what Bob was intending to do, he began to take us out frequently in his own little Monterey fish boat, along with his Filipino friends, who were wily. They taught Bob all the fishing tricks they knew, mostly how to bait hooks, where to catch fish, primarily sea bass under Golden Gate Bridge. These crafty old-timers kept an eye open always for the ever-present fish and game inspectors. Homeward bound after every fishing, they'd stash the over-limit fish in bags, hung by hooks on pilings outside the harbour, to collect later when the coast was clear. In between these invaluable expeditions, which helped put plenty of bony sea bass on our dinner table, we continued our drives north or south, searching the coastal harbours. We were always guessing where Kelly might be and when he'd return to Monterey. My memories of those drives are filled with the aroma from the garlic fields in Salinas and the sight of tall, spiky shadows of artichokes piercing the morning haze in the fields. Mm-hmm. One day little St. Anthony was no longer tied up when we arrived in Point Arena. Then the hunt began in earnest. For the next week we drove to every harbour where she might be as he sailed down the coast. We pulled into Half Moon Bay with low expectations, but at the far end of the dock, there she was. The main cabin door was open. A slightly built, grizzle-haired man was leaning over the rail, adjusting a fender. Sharp barking came from the little dachshund on deck, made him look up as we approached, and he looked away. Bob called to him, asked if he was Kelly, and if we might have permission to come aboard. Kelly was reluctant to enter into much conversation, but Bob was a warm, persuasive man, and eventually we were invited on board. Our interest in the boat didn't impress Kelly at all. I think he knew who we were and why we were there. Later he said we looked like fancy sailing folk, far better suited to another kind of fleet. Gradually he opened up to us, and we began to learn more about this well-built boat we had been so drawn to. Little St. Anthony had been built in the late 1940s at the Kettenberg Yacht Boat Yard in San Diego, he said. It was part of an effort after World War II, when the United States government had appealed to boat builders to revive the fishing fleet and industry, and she was one from that effort. He acknowledged that we did have a good eye for a fine boat. He quickly made one thing quite clear. He was happy to talk about her, but she was not for sale. We could look and talk all we liked. She was not for sale. We sat around for an hour or so, and he had good stories. He loved that boat, which had been part of his life for so many years. Gradually, he unfolded the layers of his life. He was bemused that at his age, an old man, he had a young girlfriend who was good to him. Not only that, but they had a 2-year-old son together. She really wanted him to settle down to life ashore, to be a father to the little boy, whom he talked about with obvious pleasure, and to be part of this unplanned family that had come so late into his life. Nevertheless, he was torn between two lives and resisted having to give up this safe haven. As we were departing, he told us that it had been nice visiting with us and that he would be leaving soon for Monterey. We felt encouraged that perhaps it would only be a matter of time. From the start, we knew we'd found the boat of our dreams, no matter how firmly he told us no. It would only take him a couple of days sailing down the coast, we calculated, so with breathless hope, we drove back down the highway one more time. The sound of the waves on the nearby shores was like a chorus. Kelly was on board when we arrived at the harbour in the early afternoon. He seemed to be waiting for us. He invited us on board and listened carefully while Bob made his offer. We told him that we were planning to stay in a motel in Monterey Harbour that night and would return in the morning if that suited him. That evening we were elated. We were remarkably unconcerned that we had no idea how or what we were embarking on. We only knew we could do it. What I remember most when we returned the next morning was that not only Kelly was on board, so was his girlfriend Dawn and their little son in his arms. Little St. Anthony was ours. Everyone was happy, maybe even Kelly. We drove back to San Francisco, having made arrangements for Kelly and Bob to meet at the harbour the following week and sail up the coast together to Moss Landing for a hull inspection. And so Bob joined Kelly as planned. They set sail and I drove home. He phoned me when they arrived at Moss Landing, and I packed the car with sleeping bags and supplies for us to stay on board for a few days. I was there in time to see the overhead gantry lift Little St. Anthony's substantial hull out of the water, with Bob and Kelly tenderly guiding her into the dry dock cradle. I saw we had neighbours, also newly arrived. A large old fishing boat with its night lure lanterns on deck and a half a dozen animated Italian-speaking deckhands who greeted us. Miming offers to help, they hoisted long ladders we needed to get on and off our boat, now standing 20 feet above dry ground. It was daunting, but hard not to get excited. We said our goodbyes to Kelly, who was hastily loading his small dog and gear into the truck that Dawn had driven up to take him home. We were all starting new lives, and we knew it was hard for him. He didn't look back as he drove away. With our bags of supplies, oilskins, binoculars finally stowed where he wanted them, Bob fired up the diesel stove in the main cabin. And while he was finding out where everything was, how it worked, he had a suggestion for me. Think you could make a batch of brownies with a few extras for our neighbours? See what you can do. Brownies are a language which need no translation, and cooking even in a strange diesel-fired oven is no mystery. In fact, that stove would become the main source of heat for us in the future on cold and stormy days at sea. Now was the time to find out how to cook in it. No sooner had I taken over a plate piled high with tasty chocolate treats when our new friends came right back with a huge bucket of fresh squid. As I mined my way through the language barrier, they quickly gathered that I had no idea what to do with their calamari, let alone how to clean and cook them. It took a minute and a sharp knife, plenty of garlic and butter for them to demonstrate. They, in turn, loved the idea that brownies could be made from a package and were delighted to accept the extra box of mix I had. Each day we shared with one another our favorite recipes without understanding a word the other said. I had little else to do besides cook and spend many hours on deck. The grandstand view of the ocean to the west and the sweep of the estuary to the east. Judging by the constant flights of groups of pelicans all day long, we were close to their nesting grounds and on direct path of the flight school of these extraordinary birds as they skimmed the water in front of us. The first night of primitive living on board, we discovered the most urgent priority: to replace the old flea-infested foam bunk cushions. The marine survey completed and all the transfer of ownership finalized. The only thing left to do was to sail the boat home to San Francisco. So before I drove home, planning to leave Bob down there, we made a phone call to our old friend Babe Lamerton, an experienced yacht skipper. To Bob's delight, Babe said he was more than happy to make the journey with him and would drive down the next day. They got together, sailed off, and about a week later they sailed into our berth in the marina, wreathed in grins, and after an exhilarating first for both of them. On the way up the coast they had tested every piece of equipment, run sea trials on the engine, and unable to resist, they put the Gerdies and winches to work. They had lowered the long line outrigger poles with some scrounge bait, caught 2 salmon. We saw that as a very good omen. We settled down into our new routine. I soon found a job with a little income and plenty of flexibility in the office of a friend, and we could count on a modest but steady paycheck, leaving Bob free to work on what would be a complex restoration of the boat. After the urgent replacement and yacht-like quality upgrade of the bunks, the list was long. A few massive planks had to be spliced into the hull. The pipe berths down below were to be transferred into work and tool benches and storage. In the fish hold, the damaged copper refrigerator system needed to be salvaged if possible, and the hold itself needed radical cleaning. The engines were sound but needed overhauling, and she needed a good coat of paint. There was much to be done to this lovely but neglected old boat, which smelled pungently of old fish and diesel. Bob calculated the work could be complete in time for the next salmon season in September 1974.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
If you want more, I have them, but if you don't, I will do them another time.
Okay, how are we doing, Linda?
I think that's.
Okay, thank you so much, Barbara.